Welcome. I'm Professor Jagdish Sheth at Emory University. This presentation is all about rise of Africa. I believe Africa as a sleeping giant will surprise all of us in the second half of this century, 21st century, as China surprised all of us in the first half of the 21st century. Nobody imagined the rise of China, let's say in late 1900s, 1990s, and all of a sudden we find China has become the second largest economy, followed now very quickly under purchasing power parity by India, and people are as surprised about the rise of India. I think we'll have the same kind of a surprise, passion, enthusiasm about the rise of Africa in the second half of the 21st century. The title of the presentation is called The African Awakening. Will the giant wake up? In fact, actually the question should be, who will wake up the giant? So let's look at the economic trends. And if you look at a historical perspective about economic growth engines for world growth, we have always labeled 1800s as the European century because European colonial powers, through global expansion, created a huge economic growth and modernized many parts of the world. European century was displaced in 1900s by what is called the American century, where America became the largest market, largest sourcing destination, largest everything, and became a major economic growth engine for the world. And of course, in the 21st century, this century, the first half, it's all about Asian century, as it is called, primarily led by China. Japan, of course, is there, and of course, India, the ASEAN nations, the Southeast Asia, South Korea, etc. So it's called the Asian century. My view is that the Asian century will last only about half a century, primarily because China will age much faster than we all anticipated and will have an aging population very similar to Japan aging. And that's going to basically happen by 2040, 2050. China will become more advanced economy, will shift toward more services, etc. So the next frontier is something else or somebody else, and that is likely to be the continent of Africa, not a single nation of Africa. So the second half of the 21st century will be the African century. Why the rise of Africa is inevitable? And there are four reasons, at least, that I can articulate. The first reason is that there is a growth of the brand-conscious middle class all over Africa, both sub-Saharan Africa and the whole continent of Africa. Africa is modernizing much faster than we realized, not just in urban cities as one would expect, but also into second tier and even rural markets. As we all travel to Africa, we are actually astounded how much people are shifting from branded, non-branded consumption, the street vendor kind of a consumption, to more and more branded consumption. And therefore the consumer economy will get more and more commercialized and will be a growth engine for Africa. It is the largest resource continent in the world by a magnitude compared to America, for example, compared to China, compared to India, Australia, any large landmass. There is nothing like Africa. I think that's going to give it a comparative advantage, a resource-based advantage. Surprisingly, Africa has a very large amount and a percentage of what I call entrepreneurial DNA. Entrepreneurship is universal. It does not recognize literacy. Most illiterate people are more entrepreneurial sometimes than literate people. It does not recognize faith. Every faith has entrepreneurs. It does not recognize gender. Women are as good entrepreneurs as men. And it does not recognize age. Young people can be entrepreneurs, older people can be entrepreneurs. So how do you unlock this entrepreneurship? And how will that happen? And how do you unlock the human potential through entrepreneurship, not just through education? I think will be one more thing we'll be talking about. And of course, Africa is transitioning from the traditional agrarian economy to more and more industrial economy. The transition of the African economy from agriculture, industrial raw material based economy to more and more value-added manufactured based economy will be also enabled by outsiders, especially world agencies like the United Nations, UNIDO, for example, UNESCO, for example, WHO, for example. All of them will try to modernize Africa to bring them into the 21st century. So here are the four main reasons, as I discussed. And here are some numbers to show that this seems like the trend. The total GDP of 54 nations all over Africa is about $6 trillion based on purchasing power parity, which I think is a better measure in general, which is the buying power as opposed to conversion into the dollar economy at the exchange rates. 6 trillion is not a small economy. The sub-Saharan nations themselves also are by themselves at least $4 trillion based on purchasing power parity. The average annual growth in 2017 to 15 as an average is 4.6% and increasing. Of course, there's a lot of variation between nations within Africa. Some are growing at about 10-11%, others are actually stagnant or negative growth even, but average is more fascinating to watch. Average as a whole subcontinent or sub-Sahara continent is 4.6%, which is not small given that the world is desperately struggling for economic growth, especially among advanced economies. And the growth of China begins to slow down with the aging of its population and it becomes a mature economy. I was very surprised to also find that the total population of Africa as a continent now exceeds 1 billion people. If you look at the rise of America, the rise of China, the rise of India, they're all primarily based upon consumer economy, where numbers matter. So a billion population all aspiring to become brand conscious middle class consumers creates a huge economic spark. And as we know, the US economy, Chinese economy, and to some extent Indian economy, the largest sector is the consumer economy as opposed to industrial economy or military. And the GDP per capita as measured in purchasing power parity is actually not shabby. It is $4,870, which says that while they do have the base of the pyramid, which means $2 per day income, population $700, actually in a purchasing power parity it is much bigger buying power, and the average surprisingly is 4,870, which again is a huge range between nations within Africa. Punchline: Africa has the size but not the scale, partly because the continent is divided by countries. Each country has their own policy and the agenda. Each country has different leadership. Each country has different external influences, however you analyze it. So if there was some way one can take the size of the continent and make it into a scale-oriented economy or a continent, we'll have a huge world economic growth, but it'll take several decades to engage or get it done. So if you like the new measures of world economy, which is the purchasing power parity, you find that China is already $20 trillion. not in GDP, but in PPP. US is now second at $18 trillion, and US will lag behind as China grows much faster. For example, 2% or 2.5% growth in America versus 6.5% growth in China will widen the gap as you go into the future. India is at $8 trillion today based upon World Bank data, but it is again with demonetization policy of the government, the cash economy becoming more and more actually a non-cash economy, leapfrogging from the computer revolution or a PC revolution to a cell phone revolution, growth of the e-commerce and everything you look at it, it is interesting to see India is growing faster even than China, and of course much faster than all advanced economies, so the gap will rise. In fact, some reports have articulated, especially by PwC, that it is very possible if you extrapolate the current growth trends and modernization that's taking place, that India will actually become the largest single economy on purchasing power parity, China will be the second largest, and America will be the third economy. The rest of the nations will get more and more marginalized on purchasing power parity as a measure. I wrote a book called Chindia Rising. The first edition was in 2008, where I felt very strongly that the rise of China and India will make a difference on world economy, but definitely on world geopolitics. And it is happening. I updated the book about 2015 or so, and my revision basically came to a conclusion that what was forecasted in 2007-8 has happened or is happening sooner than I expected. The only issue with China and India, as will be with Africa, as I will articulate, is not the technology anymore. It is not capital, surprisingly, which are the old industrial models of creating economic growth, but surprisingly it will be the environment. Environment will be the showstopper. It'll shut itself down. If too much extraction we do, too much exploitation we do, without replanting the natural resources, which one can do if they're vegetation based, such as tree planting, deforestations could be done, but if they are industrial resources, we don't know how to replant it. Might be better to actually do more conservation based exploration, extraction, etc., which is a key issue Africa will face as a matter of time, because it is the largest source of natural resources in the world. But this book articulated, Chindia Rising, that compared to the old triad power will emerge a new triad power, which led for me to start a new policy institute, the new triad power. It's called India, China, America Institute, and I will talk about that later on, about how that will have a huge influence on the future of Africa. So let's look at the old triad power. As of 1987, which is not that far in the past, 45% of the world trade was only among 15 nations, the 12 common market European nations, such as Germany, such as France, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Italy, etc., and the two North American nations, America and Canada, and Japan as a late entrant after World War II. These 15 nations engaged in trade 45% among themselves. 55%, of course, was mostly with their ex-colonies, the Commonwealth nations, for example, but they're mostly to get raw materials from them to do value add in their own markets. And therefore, when you look at the GDP concentration, 70% of the world GDP was all within these 15 countries. The rest of the world didn't matter, no matter what was their population size. This 15 nation is aging and aging very rapidly. It is desperately looking for growth domestically and can't do it. And if you don't create growth domestically, in the process create employment and wealth for the ordinary people, if the ordinary people are out of job, the politicians are out of job, as we have seen enormous anti-incumbency in all these advanced economies. They want some fresh blood to say, save our wallets and save our jobs. This is leading to a shift in world economy into what I call the new triad power, based upon the World Bank numbers measured on purchasing power parity, which is the buying power of the nation, not the exchange rate and the speculation in the exchange rates. United States will still continue to be the dominant power for some time, although not number one position, but it'll be definitely among the top three. And there's a distant gap after three, for example. But the second nation is China, and the third one is India. Unlike the previous triad power that I showed you, Japan, Europe, Western Europe, and America, there was a harmony of relationship. Same viewpoint, because America defeated Japan and Germany and came out with a world order in terms of world institutions, like, for example, the IMF and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods Conference as it is called, the United Nations as another agency that was created, agencies within United Nations in terms of a global architecture. America had the wealth to invest into Japan and reconstruct Japan, the Marshall Plan for Germany, for example, and continued the journey as in the last century, which is why it's called the American century in many ways. But this harmony and a common view that capitalism is the foundation, democracy is the way to really have a governance mechanism, having a common enemy in Cold War called the Soviet Union, this is not the reality anymore. The new triad power comes from very different perspectives. China has a communist legacy, as it is becoming more and more capitalistic through economic reforms and policy changes. India was organized as a socialistic pattern of society, more of a Leninist thinking. There are certain commanding height industries that you never allow private sector because they will exploit it. Mistrust of capitalism. Government should be as much in social programs as it should be in economic aspects by and large. That is changing since the 1991 reforms in India, economic reforms, but it still has the DNA of not trusting capitalism in its pure form. And you have America, which is the other extreme of raw capitalism, or what I call cowboy capitalism. Trust everything to capitalism till market fails. Like the great economic recession of 2007 and 8, or in certain industries, the fight for standards, for example, in the cellular industry, where you begin to say, let the government come out with a policy and a dictate, as we did with anti-smoking, for example. Market was failing, as there are many industries, but it basically says, give the benefit of doubt to the capitalist first before the government intervenes through policy changes. Three different ideologies. Not only that, each one has their own economic advisors, security advisors, and surprisingly, they have long memories. There are people in the Indian advisory policy making, crowd in some fashion, who still remember all the way, in fact, to non-alignment policy. So is true in America. Only nation that has gone forward, forgetting the legacy of communism and all the history behind, seems to be China. China is emerging more pragmatic and changing the economic advisors accordingly and the policy advisors. But new triad power is real, except this new triad power, creating a harmony among them, is going to be a challenging task. Out of this new triad power, you see a strategic repositioning of Africa. Africa should have been invested over 200 years in a positive way, as opposed to a colonial approach by the Europeans from 1800s, as the Europeans did in America. But they kept Africa more like a colony, more extracting its raw materials. So Africa never transitioned properly from the agriculture-based economy or industrial raw material economy to actually an industrialized nation. I think Africa will be awakened by, the giant will be awakened by the new triad power. And that means it'll be a race for resources by these three nations, America, China, and India. Both soft power and hard power will be utilized by all three nations, surprisingly. And all these three nations will begin to shift its focus away from their own historical alignments toward more and more Africa. We have already seen Chinese investment in Africa to a level that is unprecedented. No European economy has ever done that kind of a magnitude of investment, and so also has not America for the last century. But now America as a competitor to China, or China emerging as a major rival both economically, militarily, and maybe even politically, is interesting. Everybody will focus on Africa. So to conclude this, rise of Africa is inevitable and has the potential to become the growth engine for the world, including growth for China, which domestic growth will slow down. They will find some other place. India down the road, same thing. Definitely by 2050, if it continues its journey, and America now. This will lead to Africa's geopolitical realignment with this new triad power, and in the process, the continental Europe will get marginalized in terms of its influence, impact on Africa. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.